Welcome to my channel. I'm a landscape photographer and my name's Stephen Milner. So a few weeks back I released a video on the brand new Ilford Ortho Plus and when I ordered that film I received 2 rolls and I shot the first film. If you haven't watched that video I encourage you to check it out. I give my initial thoughts and I'll put a link up kind of here somewhere for you to look at that. So a few weeks ago I shot the other roll, and now that I've shot it twice I kind of feel like I'm in a bit more of a better position to give more of a kind of image review and thoughts on the actual film. So I wanted to do another video and give a bit more of a kind of landscape photographer's perspective and go through some of the images and just talk to them and just say what I like, what I don't like, and just give some thoughts. So like I said, the first roll was shot a few months ago and I shot it locally to me in Hamilton here in New Zealand, down at the Waikato River, which is not far from where I live, and it was a sunrise shot and I exposed a full roll, and from that there were a few images that I really liked, so I just wanted to go over those with you now. And so the first image here is a shot that I did kind of facing away from the sunrise, shooting down the river, and as you can see there's some quite nice mist on the water because it was early in the morning. And I was metering the scene with my light meter. I also had a soft grad natural density filter in there. And as you can see from the image, I mean there was no clouds in the sky, but there's definitely no detail really there. In terms of the shadows, I think it's retaining the detail in the shadows quite well, and I quite like how it's rendering the shadow areas and the greens. They're quite dark greens and they're quite nice. I guess it's a high contrast scene. It's quite a nice shot. I like it, and there's some symmetry there. The next image was a bit more of a detailed shot of the bushes and the trees that were lining the river on the opposite side to where I was set up with my camera. And I was again metering with my light meter. The sun hadn't risen at this point, so it's still very low dynamic range, and I think from memory as I was metering the scene, the dynamic range of the scene was only 2 stops, which from what I can gather is the capability of the film. So as you can see from this image, it's rendered the trees beautifully, and there's lots of tonality and luminosity throughout those trees, from the highlights to the shadows, and the reflections are showing up quite beautifully, and I was really happy with this image. The best thing I can say about this film with this type of shot is how beautifully it's rendered the trees and the greens that were not in direct sunlight, and it's just given a beautiful shot. So that was the first roll that I shot. Now the second roll I shot a few weeks ago, and I was lucky enough to travel to the far north of New Zealand, up towards Cape Reinga, which is the most northerly point you can visit, and just below there's a place called Te Paki Sand Dunes which has some giant sand dunes in there. I was there for 5 days and I was shooting a number of different types of rolls, and I've still yet to release those videos, so stay tuned for those. But on one of those days I had my roll of Ilford Ortho Plus with me, so I thought I would shoot that. I have to say that I was really initially I didn't like the images, I have to say that, and I think that comes down to the dynamic range of the film. It doesn't have a big dynamic range, this film, and what that means is that you've got to make a decision on whether you value the detail in the highlights or you value the detail in the shadows, and you have to go with one or the other. But anyway, I've received the film back. I scanned it in to my computer and I've been looking at them and just kind of mulling them over, and they're starting to grow me, and I'm starting to see a bit more of what this film's actually about. So we'll go through some of these images. It was, nevertheless, it was a really cool trip to travel up to the far north of New Zealand, and I got more than just these images, and you'll see those in future videos. So the first image here is just, I guess, a detailed shot of the lines in the sand dunes, and as you can see from the image, it's picking up the shadows and the details with a real dark tone, and the sun was setting on the other side of the sand dune, so this sand dune area that you can see was all in shadow, and there was no clouds in the sky. But anyway, even if there was, I don't think you would see too much. But I like the image anyway. I think the form of the sand dune is interesting. It's a nice photo. And this photo I thought would be slightly different. At the time I was taking these photos was at the same time as the bushfires were occurring in Australia, And as unfortunate as that is for the people that live over there, what actually happened is a lot of the smoke drifted over New Zealand, and as I was taking these photos, there was just a thick fog on the horizon that was just drifting towards New Zealand. And as the sun was setting, there was this kind of orange ball that was just kind of approaching the horizon. And I thought it'd be quite interesting to see how this film handled that, because when you look at the description from Ilford about this film, it talks about, you know, the greens, the blues and the red sensitivities, and how it's very sensitive to green and blues but not so sensitive to reds and oranges, and any red and oranges that are in the scene will appear much darker. However, I guess in the case of this image, the sun is actually completely white, so I guess if you're going to be taking photos of the sun in sunrise and sunset where it's orange, it's not going to turn up darker, it's going to be bright white. But from this image, what I find really interesting is the curve that goes through the foreground, and the sand around that area is much darker than the area below it, which arguably should be the other way around in terms of light, because the light was shining on the top of this sand dune, but when you look below it, it's lighter. Initially, when I looked at this image, I thought, oh, that doesn't look right, something's wrong. But as I've thought about it, what's actually happening there is you've got the kind of yellowy orangey colour of the sand that's actually catching the orange light from the sun, and because of the characteristics of the film, it's producing a black tone instead of a bright tone. So it's interesting. The more I look at this, I quite like it, because the blackness highlights that curve that goes through the foreground that leads your eye up towards the sun. So anyway, I took a few more images as I was walking around, and it's quite a unique landscape. There's not much there. It really is just kind of sand dunes and the shapes of those sand dunes. And I was really interested in some of the shapes, and I was trying to work with them and try and come up with something that was meaningful and worked well together. And you know, as a composition, I had some leading lines. And I came across this scene, and I really liked the curve that came through the foreground, and the form of the sand dune on the horizon was really unique. And this was one of the largest sand dunes in the area, and the sun was setting to the left hand side of this sand dune, and as you can see, because it was catching the sun. And also interesting with this one, because on the right hand side of the sand dune is equally as dark, which is confusing in terms of how this film works, because if you base it on the previous image, the left-hand side of the sand dune should have been darker, and the right-hand side maybe should have been brighter, but it's not. So I guess I'm starting to feel like I just don't know what I'm going to get with this film until I've shot with it some more, perhaps. But anyway, back to this image. I like it because it's, you know, the shadow areas in the foreground are dark, and the actual sand dune itself is really dark, and then there's, you know, bright light in the foreground and in the sky, and it's, you know, it's a very contrasty image, and I quite like it. The more I look at this, the more I like this image. And I walked around some more while I was there. I was there for a good few hours. And then the final image that I selected to show you today is this one. And at this point I was kind of quite high up on top of the sand dunes looking down, and I came across these interesting sand formations. And I have to say, at this point it was really, really windy, and you can kind of see in some of the sand dune there, it's the wind's blowing the sand around. So it's quite interesting that, you know, the film's caught that. I really like the lines and the shapes in this image, and the fact that it leads up towards the sun again. It's quite interesting. And as you can see this time, you know, part of the sand dunes, particularly in the shadows, are dark, and the top is bright, so it's kind of a little bit confusing to look at, you know, when I consider this image. And you'd almost expect, you know, the flat area here on top to be darker than the actual shadows, but it's not. So I guess it's fair to say the film has got some quite unique characteristics, and until you've used it a number of times, I don't think that you can go into a composition and a shot with a clear vision of what you're going to get out of the image. So I think it's fair to say that the dynamic range of this film is low, and when I say that, I mean that if you're working with a scene that's got lots of bright light and deep shadows, this film's going to struggle to retain a lot of the detail in those areas. But, you know, depending on what type of shot you're trying to create, that could be okay. And if you're doing a type of black and white photography that's really contrasty, then I think this film would work well in that situation. And what I would say is that you just kind of need to decide on where you want the detail when you approach those types of shots. Okay, so I just want to quickly just cover the grain of this film. Now, some people have said to me, and I've heard and read on other reviews that, you know, people don't like the grain, or they've at least commented on that it's different to other films. So I just wanted to touch on that quickly and just do a little bit of a comparison. And so we're just going to jump into Lightroom now, and we're going to compare some photos. So this is my Lightroom quick collection, and at the top here we've got 5 different black and white films, and from the starting at the left, moving along to the right, we've got Ortho 80, we've then got Fujifilm Acros 100, we've then got Ilford Delta 400, and then we've got Ilford Delta 100, and then we've got Ilford Pan F50. So if we just do a comparison and zoom in, and we'll go to 100%. So here you've got Ortho on the right and Acros on the left. And as you can see, the grain's different, but it's not, you know, I'm having to really look at it hard to see the difference. And if I had to decide which one I prefer, I guess I couldn't say. I mean, they're just so close to each other, I don't even know if it's a problem. So then if we go to Ilford Delta 400, and again, you know, the grain, I think you can say that it's different again, but I'm not sure how different it is. I'm struggling a little bit again. And so here we've got now Delta 100 on the left and Ortho on the right. And again, you know, the grain, it looks very similar. Again, I'm not really sure what the difference is. I'm struggling a little bit. And then finally, we've got Pan F50 on the left and then Ortho on the right. And again, the grain, I'd say the Pan F50 had more grain than the Ortho, which is interesting because Pan F50 is an ISO 50. So yeah, I mean, that's a very quick comparison of the film's grain. So yeah, I guess it's hard to say what the difference is. I'm no expert in terms of film grain, but I guess just looking at it on the screen, it's really hard to tell. But you know, with grain, you know, what really matters to me anyway is how it looks on print. So I decided that I would print one of my images. So I decided to print this image here, and I printed this image on Hahnemühle Fine Art Pearl, which is a glossy photo fine art paper. And I have to say that it rendered the image, you know, beautifully. I was really pleased with how the image turned out, and I looked really closely to try and see the grain. And to be perfectly honest, when you look at this print on this paper, I can see more of the texture of the paper than I can actually of the grain. So I think it's fair to say, if you were uncomfortable with the grain and how it looks on the computer, then my advice would be to obviously print a test page and see how that looks. And from the test page that I've done, you can barely see it, so I don't think it's a problem. So I just want to wrap up on this video, and more specifically on Ilford Ortho Plus 80 itself. I haven't decided on whether I'm going to use this film more or not. I'm still experimenting with some other black and white films. In terms of the other films that I've shot so far, I would compare this film quite closely to Ilford Pan F50. I think it's very close to that film in terms of how it looks. However, I think Ilford Ortho Plus has more contrast, and you would get more of a contrasty image out of the film itself compared to Pan F50. So I guess it really comes down to, as a landscape photographer, it comes down to whether you want an image that has high contrast or not. And if you do, then I would recommend this film, and you should give it a go. But if you don't want high contrast black and white images, then I would suggest you try something different like Delta 400 or Fujifilm Acros 100 and try one of those films out. So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed that, and if you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. That's really cool. But if you do that, I'd hope you'd tell me why in the comments below. And if you just want to leave a comment anyway, that's cool. I always reply, I'd appreciate that. And if you like what I'm doing, subscribe to my channel. You can do that. There's a red button just down down here somewhere that you can press, and if you hit the notification bell, you'll be notified when I upload a video. So that's it. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.